this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to the World War II podcast. Today I'm joined by Peter Zablocki, a professor at Caldwell University, host of the History Shorts podcast, and author of The Death of General Sikorski. I was introduced to Peter after I recorded the episode looking at the death of General Sikorski with Chris Wroblewski. Chatting, I discovered Peter had researched and written about an entirely different but fascinating subject, Private Snafu. Now, for those unfamiliar, Private Snafu was the star of a series of black and white animated shorts produced between 1943 and 1945. These instructional films aimed at US servicemen combined irony and humour with serious messages. Amazingly, they were produced by Frank Capra, who went on to direct It's a Wonderful Life, written by Theodor Geisel, who would become Dr. Seuss, and voiced by Mel Blanc, the legendary voice behind Bugs Bunny. Despite their playful tone, the films served a crucial role in military training and morale during the war. Peter, it's great to have you here, and thanks for joining me. Let's start with what was the problem these short films were trying to solve?
So the issue here really stems from the fact that most of the people that are joining the U.S. military are uneducated. That's really what it comes down to. So initially there's 5 million people that volunteer. Then they put in the Selective Service Act. They draft another 10 million. So you have about 15 million in the first few months of the war, of U.S. involvement. But out of those 50 million or so, only about 70 have a high school degree. And actually, when you look at the statistics that were given to the U.S. military, it said that the average mental maturity of an American soldier was anywhere between the ages of 12 and 14. So now you're looking at, okay, so we're teaching these guys intense concepts may be difficult. So even before cartoons, the biggest growing medium in the United States in the 1930s was actually comic books. And comic books started doing the same exact thing that eventually the U.S. Army picks up, which is like, how do we, I wouldn't want to use the word dumb down, but how do we simplify and entertain our youth in a sense where we could still send a message? And comic books did that for, before the United States joins World War II, 1930s, you have, Superman, you have Captain Marvel, eventually Captain America comes out. You have all of these patriotic messages to a country that's still very much isolationist, that's already driving this idea of like, oh, we should fight for democracy, we should do all these things. And that starts in the 30s. So that's what these guys grow up on. And they also grow up on Bugs Bunny. And Bugs Bunny, Warner Brothers, is the one studio that really embraces this idea, just like comic books do. When the United States is still considered isolationist, Warner Brothers and comic books are the front runners in the sense of starting to push this certain agenda that is going against the federal government's official version, which is we're staying neutral. And these guys grew up on that. They grew up on Bugs Bunny had a lot of anti-Nazi things going on, and these would be things that were shown before movies, and movies are extremely popular. So now all these guys are growing up reading comic books that are anti-fascism, anti-Nazi, which are actually ironically created by mostly Jewish, most of the comic books, Superman, Batman, all these, they're created by Jewish creators. Same thing with Warner Brothers. There was a huge Jewish contingent of these people that are creating these things. So it's like they're talking about what's happening in Germany 1930s through this subcontext. And now you have these young Americans that are growing up on this. They don't even know they're being indoctrined in a sense. But the U.S. Army uses that once the war starts, because now it's like, all right, so their first idea really was, we need to educate these people about sanitation, following the rules, and just not being stupid. Like that's all this was, right? Because if you think, and we'll get into this, but Snafu dies in most of the episodes. And if he's not dead, then he's locked up in a German prison, or they lock him up in a psychiatric ward. No matter how you spin it, you did not want to be called Snafu. That was actually viewed as funny as the character was, you did not want to be Snafu. The idea here is you're trying to re-educate, but really just instill a certain attitude. That's what it was. You want to instill a certain attitude into young people. And they initially started with these lectures. They would bring hundreds of people to these lecture halls. They would have these literally lectures of this is how you clean your gun. This is why it's important for you to put a net around your bed because you could get malaria. They're lecturing at these people. And statistics will show you even today that if someone is lectured at, they've retained less than 10% what's being said to them, right? I mean, we know this. And now you have these guys that have a mental capacity of a 14-year-old, and a lot of them were really young. A lot of them were really 18, 19, They're not listening to these lectures. So it's like, all right, well, what else can we do? And Capra got involved, and Disney got involved as well. They did the Why We Fight series. And that series is, even to this day, I mean, you could show that in a college classroom because they've done so well.
What amuses me is if you look at the shots from Dunkirk, there is no shots from Dunkirk, but Capra stages the shots from Dunkirk that are now taken and used as real shots of Dunkirk, but they're actually fake.
As the real.
So how iconic it is.
Yes. Yeah. That's a Disney produced thing. But if you notice, when you look at those, there's a lot of animation in that. The Disney actually is the one that provides that animation. But if you watch them now, the Why We Fight series, it incorporates stage, like you said, and also real footage of, hey, this is what's been happening. Let's catch you up of why we're going to send you across the Atlantic right now or the Pacific, right? And there is a lot of animation in it because they would have a map. And then the map, you see the swastika spreading over the map. It's like this visual. And that was based on the studies that they did was these guys need visual. They're visual learners. They're not so educated. We need to somehow visualize it. So while those worked for the bigger picture of why we're going to fight and so on and so forth, they're like, all right, that's great. We could indoctrinate them that way. But once we send them out and they go to their units, how do we continue that? We're not going to show them documentaries all the time, but there's going to be a movie that's going to be sent over. So every unit that went somewhere, whenever you were in the back, you weren't in the front lines, there was always a movie showing. And, everyone would sit there and smoke their cigarettes and watch whatever the new movie was. So they're like, well, they're going to want to do that because that to them, that's entertainment. To them, that's disconnecting from the harsh reality of the front. So let's do something they're already used to. They're used to watching cartoons that are about 4 or 5 minutes before a feature. That was the thing. There was no trailers when you went back to the movies in 30s, 40s. You watched a little cartoon. So they're like, let's do that. Let's create this cartoon. And that's when they turned to Warner Brothers because they're like, Warner Brothers already been kind of tricky about this. They've been kind of cheeky with this for about 5-10 years where they're already incorporating.
It's odd that Disney get overlooked, and because Disney are also churning out the patches, aren't they, for unit insignia and stuff. It's odd that Disney are not. Were Disney approached?
Based on my research, and I was looking at it because that was my question too. They did use Disney for Why We Fight, but then they switched over to Warner Brothers, and the only thing I really found was that Warner Brothers was willing and already had the writers that had figured out. You know what I mean? How to indoctrinate people without realizing it. That was the difference. Like Disney was still like, oh, here's a princess. And Warner Brothers like, dude, we've been making fun of Nazis for like 5 years and no one said anything, so that's why they went to Warner Brothers. And Warner Brothers, again, there was a big Jewish contingent then. They were like, yeah, we want to spread this message. We want to defeat the Nazis. And Mel Blanc, like you said, I mean, they look like Looney Tunes. If you look at Snafu, it's Looney Tunes. There's no question about it. I've watched a few, even with my kids now, and they're like, what are we watching? This is black and white. But then they're like, is Bugs Bunny in this? I'm like, well, actually, one episode of Bugs Bunny shows up. You could make that connection. It's there. It's still a funny show, if you think about it.
They now would be seen as incredibly problematic, but that, there is an intention behind those. Some of those problematic depictions. So if you think of it as the context of the time, I guess it fits with the messaging. But yeah, you're right. The whole I was watching and I forgot what it's called, the mosquito one where he gets malaria, and he's just sat there and the mosquito's going to bite him in his backside. He's going, he's looking at his bare bottom. He's going, he's staring at me with his best face or something like that. And it's just stupid humor that just works still.
The idea of every single one of these was to show that lack of common sense and lack of camaraderie, lack of grit and carelessness is going to get you killed. That's ultimately what it was. You have an episode where he doesn't feel like cleaning his gun. and then his gun jams, and then he dies. You know what I mean? It's like, I think in the first 6 out of the first 13 episodes, there's 26 shorts. In the first 6, he dies. You know, it's like he just keeps on dying. And after a while, people are like, man, he dies. So it became a thing of like, how stupid is he going to be? And how is he going to die in this episode? Or if he doesn't die, eventually he'll be captured or something will happen. But he was not designed as a heroic character. Think about it. A situation normal, all fouled up, which we all know it's not fouled up, right? It was something else. But obviously they couldn't put that up there. You know, this was something that you would be made fun of. You know, if you did you're like Snafu because you did something stupid. So, you know, that was deterring.
The clever thing is, though, it is something stupid, but it's what you said before. It's something lax. It's just, you know, he's not cleaned his rifle, so his rifle doesn't function. It's not that he's done something ridiculously stupid with his rifle. He just hasn't cleaned it, so it doesn't focus. Yeah, it's carelessness. There are actually little things that I guess from an army parlance should be routine that he's just not doing because he's slack.
Yeah, and same thing when he gets malaria. It's this idea of you should always be on your watch, and you know, you don't want to put this netting on over your bed, but you should, because it takes a second and you're gone. He is designed as a comic character, but also a tragic character, I guess. And it's interesting because when this was being created, and they got Capra on the project, right? So Capra is a known filmmaker. He's an award-winning filmmaker. They're like, we're not going to screw this up. So when the U.S. Army or Armed Forces designed, like, we're going to do this, they're like, we're going all out. We're getting the best. It's like saying we're going to get Steven Spielberg today, and we're going to get Tom Hanks involved in this project.
Do we know who came up with the project? Do we know who instigated it initially?
It wasn't Capra. Capra was put in charge of the project. The project was initially created it was the Army's Information and Education Division. It was a whole division that was created on how to educate people, and they did a whole lot of statistics. Based on the statistics, that's when they kind of connected the two things together, that based on the education level we have, we need to create something that's quick and something where they don't realize they're learning. And then once they came up with a plan and they approached Warner Brothers says, all right, we'll lend you the talent, you know, the colorist, whatever. It wasn't colorist, but the artist. That's when they put Capra on board. And, you know, we say Dr. Seuss is involved, but Dr. Seuss is not the Dr. Seuss yet. Dr. Seuss doesn't become ultra popular until really 1950s. So he's an artist, but he is involved in this. And then when you start looking at some of these names, you're like, oh wow, this was like a dream team.
If you watch, I think it's Gas. The gas forms itself into sort of a person. It looks like the Grinch.
That's what it was. At one point, you're right. Yes,
it looks like the Grinch. I'm like, no, that's the Grinch. I can't believe that's the Grinch. This is like the proto Grinch of the Grinch. Before that, it just looked exactly like him. Quite remarkable. I guess all these sparks are flying with people who are knocking these things out, because they're producing them at quite a rate as well, aren't they?
Yeah. But what I was trying to get to is the fact that this was considered top secret initially, which is crazy. You know, it had literally the top secret stamp on it. You could not talk about this project. You're making a cartoon that has a top secret designation, which I thought was really interesting. This was not something you wanted, you know, the access to get their hands on. And really, we're just talking about 4-minute silly cartoons. But in a sense, it also, I think, subconsciously talks about the problems that the U.S. Army has, right? Because you don't want the enemy to know, like, what issues that they're dealing with.
I wondered, on that same note, I couldn't really understand why they were top secret. And I did wonder if it was because the racial stereotyping is extreme.
Super extreme. This would never fly today. Yeah, no way.
The Japanese are big teeth, beer bottle glasses, can't see anything. The Germans are big, fat, stupid people, brutish. And I did wonder if they thought, if the Japanese put out that this is how we're drawing them, it might motivate the Japanese, so we'll just keep it secret. But I guess that's not wrong, because it's been depicted.
Yeah, I don't think they cared about that. That's the thing. So based on my research is, because I was looking at it, this idea of stereotyping, as you mentioned, right? So Japanese people are viewed as cunning, distrustful. It seemed like they were smart and intelligent, but really that wasn't intelligent. They were just tricky. You know, that was the whole thing, right? So if things worked out for the Japanese, aka Pearl Harbor, right? Philippines, it worked out for them, but it didn't work out because of their intelligence. It worked out because they were tricksters. You know, that was the whole message being sent there, and also the visual stereotype as well. Like I said, the buck teeth and you know, all that. And the Germans were just viewed as these big buffoons. You know, they're just overpower everything. This idea of, you know, you're looking at the blitzkrieg, they're just bully through everything. They're not thinking. They're just, dumb oafs in a sense. Like they don't know what they're doing. They're just these big guys. But it was designed like that purposely. There's a double-edged sword here because you wanted to ridicule your enemy. And these depictions were really well received by the American soldiers. These are the enemies. I'm trying to kill the enemy before they kill me. But at the same time, if you look at these episodes, you realize that the Japanese, through their trickery, supposed trickery, are successful. Snafu dies, right? And the Germans, they're brutish, but guess what? They still kill Snafu, right? So all of a sudden, it was this idea of, all right, you can make fun of them all you want, but they're still dangerous. And that was the big message in here. There was the stereotype. They wanted to see the stereotype. They were like, yeah, so it's almost like, don't be afraid of it, but if you do something silly, they will still kill you.
That's Fighting Tools, isn't it? Where his guns jam the German eventually. He becomes a prisoner of war, doesn't he? I think the German captures him at the end of that. When Snafu, you think Snafu is going to shoot him, and then he starts taking the mick out of him. And
then you have this idea of you can't trust anybody. Was that Spies? What's the one there's like the German woman?
Spies,
right? And he's drinking, and
he's going home as well, which is very similar.
Yes, and he's got the lock. I will say nothing. I will say, and they have this like beautiful, German spy woman, and she's like, oh, talk to me, and he's like, ah, and then drinking. All of a sudden you see like the zipper, like his mouth just like open up, and he's like, well, going on, blah blah blah, and then his ship that he's going home on is sunk by German U-boats, right? I think, or German boats, whatever it is, because of the fact that he told this spy that he's going home.
But it's very clever because it's the breadcrumbs throughout the whole of the episode of, he goes to the newsstand and goes, well, I just need to buy lots of magazines for my boat trip. And the bloke's going, boat trip. Gee, on a boat trip, he's going abroad somewhere. We just need to find out where he's going abroad. And this is all the little bits of information you can say, no, you can't say anything. They will pick up on the breadcrumbs, and then the femme fatale will get you in the end.
But that was the beauty of it, because you mentioned this before. This is not saying you have to be overly stupid. This is just, look, you could be silly and make one little mistake, and that could cost your life and everybody else's life. It was about teaching these soldiers common sense in a fun way. I mean, that's ultimately what this was. And comic books as well. We laugh. I mentioned comic books before, but comic books were one of the most read things that these GIs read. They were shipped over all the time. And you look at America's Best Comics, Miss Vive for Victory. You have like this. You have female characters that are strong. Mr. Marvel was the most powerful or known character at the time. It was Mr. Marvel. He was getting like 600 letters a week from young fans that just couldn't wait to join the fight. And this was, this is not a real character. Comic books continue that because it wasn't as obvious as Snafu, which, like I said, he dies, he gets captured, whatever. But it still indoctrinates this idea of like why you're fighting. You're here for, to save the world, for democracy. And really, it's fixing a problem of uneducated youth fighting, altogether. That's what it is. How do we send a message? If someone asks me, well, how come Superman, he could just finish World War II in a second. Did you ever think about that? Like, why didn't he? So there is a really cool comic book. Do you know why he wasn't fighting?
No, why?
Like every other person drafted, Clark Kent goes to the doctor. I forgot what issue it was. And he has to read the eye vision exam chart. And because he used his X-ray vision, he accidentally read the chart 3 rooms down. So he's given the letters in different order, and he's disqualified for bad vision. So he's like, all right, I guess I'll just stay and fight injustice in America. That's why Superman doesn't end World War II. It's a crazy story, and then, so he fights injustice in America, and Batman fights injustice in America. Meanwhile, you have like Captain America, you have some of these more overt ones that are fighting injustice around the world. These guys are young. I mean, Americans fighting at this time, I've interviewed so many different veterans that fought in World War II, and some of these guys are like 16. They've lied about their age. They're 16. They're 17. So for them, watching a 4-minute cartoon is definitely much more interesting than sitting through a 45-minute lecture on how to clean a gun. No question about it.
And there's a consistency. You put the film on. If you've got 4 million men to train, you put the film on, they've got the message. When you start to actually engage and really think about them, the scripts are very clever because there's endless repetition that you don't get. The joke's played out again and again and again, and it ramps up and it ramps up. So it hammers the message home all the way through without you necessarily realizing that you've been told a message. The joke's being repeated. The joke is the message. They're very sophisticated.
I'm surprised there's only 26 of them, though. I mean, they're for 4 minutes each. You could just sit through and probably watch all of them, one sitting. You think they started making them as soon as U.S. enters, so they're making them for 3 years. They laughed that Snafu is retired with the U.S. military at the end of the war because there's no need for him anymore at that point. They just like, all right, well, he did his job, it's done. Same thing with like the Yank magazine. It was just everyone's just like, all right, well, we'll close the shop. Like we don't need this anymore.
We'll just close it down. Why? Because there's actually there's 3 that never got aired.
Yes, they never made it.
The war had finished, so they didn't air them, which is, I think, is odd because you thought, well, maybe you want to think about just using them for the guys who are still being trained, who are going to be fed in to free up the guys. No, we've finished that.
Yeah, it's done. War's over. It's done. I think it was designed to be sent over with films to the field. You know what I mean? It was designed for people or soldiers that are somewhere on the front lines. And at that point, it's like if we're pulling most of them off, we no longer really need the same level of, I guess, indoctrination. I keep on using that word, but it is interesting. They kind of retired him. And all these guys went back to doing their own thing. They went back to doing Bugs Bunny.
I guess you maybe don't want the same level of racial stereotyping, making your enemy to be evil when you're suddenly, actually, we're an occupying nation. We don't necessarily want our men to hate these people because we've now got the Cold War brewing and we kind of need them to be our friends in this slightly peculiar world. What's interesting, one of the ones that doesn't get shown, I think it's Going Home, which is about not saying anything about your troops or your weapons or anything. And then there's a really weird bit where he's sitting in the cinema and they're going, oh, what happens if we've got a new super weapon that, say, destroys an island? You think, that's the nuclear bomb they're talking about. Don't say anything about it. Oh, that must be really close to the end of the war.
That was an interesting episode because and I think when I was doing the idea and research on it as to why some of these things were classified for that reason, that episode actually came up. It talked about things that while it seemed like it was far-fetched, a lot of the stuff it seemed like far-fetched, like blowing up an island, was actually a lot more real than not real, and it's like...
And the Manhattan Project's huge, so there must be there's a lot of GIs somewhere involved, and if they're just standing on gates guarding things, there's a lot of people involved who could potentially just say something that could be picked up on.
So Snafu kind of goes away, but it doesn't mean that very idea goes away. Obviously, the demographic changes, but by the time Korea, there's no Snafu. But by the time Vietnam comes along, they kind of incorporate ideas from Snafu and the comic book industry, and they start, like, if you look at a manual on how to disassemble or assemble an M16 rifle, it's a comic book. Yeah, it's a comic book with this like, there's one version that has this like really busty woman doing it. So it's like using these ideas because by 1970s, most of the people that are going have a high school degree. A lot of them don't have anything past high school degree. That's another thing about Vietnam is that, college people stayed in college. But at least now you have more high school educated people. So you maybe don't need the same level. And also, the media TVs are out. The media has changed. But they use the same idea of silliness. They use the same idea of entertainment to educate that started off with Snafu and comic books in the 40s, and they just simply incorporate that into these graphic novel booklets that are handed out to GIs in soldiers in Vietnam. Like, this is how, same as malaria, same premise. It was a little graphic novel. Like, this is what will happen if it was a comic book. Some things don't change, and I feel like now, I guess that's obsolete.
It would be interesting to know if by Vietnam they've still got the same stellar cast of people putting these things together. Because the Snafu, they're 4 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes, incredibly punchy, phenomenally talented people putting them together, presumably working on whatever the government wage is. And if they could do that in private life, in actually making Bugs Bunny cartoons, they'd be earning a lot more money. I wonder if you've got the same sort of people doing it at the Vietnam level for a patriotic.
There's no way that would be a thing. That's the thing. World War II is a total war, right? I mean, there's government agencies for everything, specifically in the United States, where Hollywood was highly involved in World War II. And that wasn't just Warner Bros. I mean, when you think of the Ghost Army, I mean, that was a Hollywood production, really, right? Creating the Ghost on D-Day when they got all these balloons, and they brought Hollywood sound people to drum up the sounds of tanks going to, make this illusion. Hollywood is very involved. Ronald Reagan, a future president of the United States, is, by the way, people don't realize that, but he was like nearly blind. He had a terrible vision. So he stays stateside. Everyone's like, oh, he's staying stateside. But he made movies. He made films that were feature films that were kind of like Snafu, but they were, they were feature movies. There were movies where you finished the movie and you were like, yes, I love being in uniform. Like I am a hero. I'm doing the right thing. Different purpose in a sense, because like you said, Snafu was quick, punchy, send a message, go. But there was a whole Hollywood studio organization designed to create patriotic films to make Americans feel good about sending their brothers and husbands. It's like, this is what we need to do. And I'm going to the movies and I'm seeing this. Everyone bought in. So the reason why you had such a group of talented people working on this is because total war, right? Everyone bought in. And if you didn't, you were shunned. You almost had to buy in, but everyone bought in.
John Ford was one of the big American directors who was working for the Army, wasn't he? I was struggling. I was thinking, who is he? It's the Western guy. Yeah.
Yep. That was it. So Hollywood radio. I mean, I listen to this day. I listen a lot to old time radio. Radio shows from the 30s and 40s, and it's always like brought to you by the Armed Forces Radio. And it was, and then you start listening to all of a sudden. There's a detective that's fighting somebody, but now it's really a Nazi spy. Before it was just a bad guy from Chicago. Now it's like, no, it's a Nazi.
That's where you get Sherlock Holmes tracking down Nazi submarines and things like you with Basil Rathbone. Everyone slowly gets slowly involved and wound into these things.
And then eventually changes to all Soviets. All of a sudden the bad guys are the Soviets. Some things don't change. But by Vietnam, you don't have that same level. Mainly because, again, it's not a total war. It's a very unpopular war. So you also have a different dynamic, different people, really, a different generation. And because it's not as popular, I don't think you would get the same level of production that you got for something as silly as a 4-minute Snafu cartoon.
And I think Snafu's successful because there's a certain I might be wrong, but I can picture the people watching it being empathetic with Snafu. And actually going, I've done that. I've skipped cleaning that. Or I have mentioned somebody about this. Oh, God, that could be me. Oh, it's Snafu, whilst he always ends up dead, is quite a good everyman kind of character in his outlook.
He's like the everyman soldier, absolutely. And just shows the little bit that it takes to make a big mistake. And it's, kind of the first thing we said when we started this conversation today was, this was about not even teaching them specifics. This was about instilling in these American soldiers common sense. That's it. If you had to create an umbrella, it was creating an attitude to be vigilant, creating an attitude of camaraderie was big in all this. Because if you notice about a lot of Snafu things, not all episodes, but a lot of them allude to the fact that if he screws up, it costs more than just his life. There is a bigger thing that happens when you screw up. And that was the one subcontext of all this was if you screw up, you like your friends around you, well, you just put them in danger. You hurt them. And it's so smartly written because there was always a message that was very clear. And there was always an underlying message as you watched all of them together. And you're like, all right, like this is bigger than just me. Whatever I do impacts the people around me. It was so smart. Today, watching it, there's a lot of Bugs Bunny cartoons that are kind of banned now as well because of racial stereotypes. You can probably find them on YouTube, but if you Google World War II cartoons, the characterizations of Asians or Germans are identical to what Snafu had, except now it's Bugs Bunny. Or Daffy Duck is he's parachuted in behind enemy lines and like Schultz. I don't know if you remember that one, but it's like. It's the same exact thing. And even those cartoons that are with characters that you're kind of like, yeah, we're not going to show that. But the difference is that Snafu, and even as we mentioned before, you had this like, super good looking German female spy. It was definitely racy and kind of it was for adults. It was not for children.
It's because they are racy. They are sort of
Sexualized, but like they're
very sexualized women. He's dancing around with and stuff. They are.
Yeah, he looks like a gas mask, and he thinks the gas mask like it looks like a woman. So he's like, I'll put this on my face. Like it's a lot of stuff here that potentially it would go over the kids' heads, but some is too blunt. It wouldn't. It was not designed for kids, and that's why. It was not something that had a public release. That's what we need to mention that. Snafu did not have a public release. This was not shown in movie theaters at home. It's like creating a manual for a soldier. That's all it was. And when the war's over, we're going to close shop and we're done. Because as much as this is a cartoon, I'm sure these guys were not thinking in 70, 80 years, someone's going to be watching this on YouTube and talking about it on a podcast. Like that was not their intent. It did what it was supposed to do. And let's move on.
Very effective. And there must have been thousands of 16mm reels of this stuff shipped everywhere. What I am intrigued by, and I'm not sure we have an answer, I do wonder if they're actually made in colour and then processed in black and white. And because you do see stills of him in colour.
Yes, you do.
But actually, all the films I've seen are black and white.
Yeah.
Now, you wouldn't black and white film, it'd be really hard trying to colour it in black and white. So I assume they're actually all in colour. So I do wonder if somewhere there's colour masters that they then just made a black and white copy and they'd have done black and white because it was cheap.
100%. I mean, that's obviously, I was going to say, so that's a cost-cutting measure, right? Black and white. But you're right. They highly likely, they might be in colour.
Wouldn't that be fascinating if you could watch them all in colour? It'd be even more impactful. It'd be even more vivid, like a Looney Tunes cartoon.
But I guess, the film itself, the physical film, color film, you're right. It was saving money. I mean, this is... they're like, okay, we want our soldiers to know this stuff, but we don't need them to be super entertained by it.
Because they must be pumping out thousands of these to distribute them across every theatre. Yeah.
Oh yeah, they went to like every unit. Yeah. They went everywhere. There was all over every front you could think of. They had Snafu cartoons. But you're right. I mean, I wonder if that exists. I'll contact someone in the World War II Museum. I'll see if they know anything.
I was looking at YouTube ones from the National Archives, I think, in the US. And they're really good quality scans. So they must have some good quality prints. Because there's a lot of crappy ones. Because I imagine you can buy them on eBay. That have probably been around the world 3 times and gone through how many projectors and they're all scratching. But there was a really nice scan. So I guess you could print them. I won't be surprised if there's somewhere, unless they chuck them, there's 35mm prints of them in colour that they then made 6mm duplicates of 16mm duplicates of. I wonder where they are, if they even exist, if they've been chucked in a skip and gone.
But I feel like you kind of brought up a good point just now. I feel like the only place you will find something like this would be in a museum. I don't think anyone's going to come out. I mean, I have a DVD of them actually. It came out in like '98, like when DVDs were just coming out. I'm trying to look for it because I know I have it somewhere. But I don't think today, in today's world, this would be like a 4K release you would go to a store and buy. I don't think so. I think at this point, specifically because of the racist undertones, and I think this would probably just belong as a museum resource. I don't think this would be a release where like, oh, I want this for my collection.
Folks, we're going to pause it there. We'll be back in a moment. They're a fantastic learning curve to explain the context of how culture was used to motivate a nation.
I had my son yesterday. I was like, hey, Lucas, can you just Google your best top 3 Snafu cartoons? And he Googles it and he's like, the anime? I'm like, no, Snafu. He's like, the only thing that pops up is anime stuff, Dad. So I looked over on his phone and sure enough, there was nothing like, you and I know this because we're historians, right? But an average person, first of all, it's like, what's Snafu? I'm like, just Google it. It's going to pop up. And it didn't. It didn't pop up, And I'm like, what do you mean it doesn't pop up? So then we had to say, all right, Private Snafu, World War, like there was so many things we had to add in order to get the first hits back to actually showcase that we're talking about. I was surprised. I thought it would just say, Snafu cartoons. Like that would be, oh yeah, but it was, some anime stuff popped up. So it's not as commonly known as you may think. So that's when I started writing this. I'm fascinated with World War II. It's, you're lucky in a sense because you have a podcast on World War II. So my podcast is just, history. And for me, whenever I come up with my topics, I'm always like, well, I'm going to talk about what I find interesting. And then after a while, as I create these, I sit down to do research and I create my scripts, I'm like, okay, this is going to becoming a World War II podcast. I need to stop, because I just want to gravitate towards it all the time. So I spread out my World War II topics as much as I can, because if not, I would just talk about World War II. But for me, when I designed a short episode for History Shorts, I write books, I write articles, and I do my daily show. So when I come up with a topic, for me in my head, it's like, all right, is this something that I want to do a 10-minute short History Shorts episode on that has maybe an hour at most, 45 minutes of research? Or is this something that I want to write a book about, which is going to take me 6 months of researching? Or is this something that I'm a little bit more interested about? It's not quite 6 months, but it's also more than just a podcast episode. So this is something I want to really dive deep into, and that's how I create my articles, right? So this is an article for me, and I got interested in it. Really, it stemmed from comic books, or this idea of I looked into comic books, and then comic books in World War II started with Captain America, and that brought me into statistics about the education level of Americans going into war. So I'm like, all right, so now I put that on the side. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So then I started looking at that. You know how it is when you Google and you start researching, you just, now I'm like, all right, the average height of an American was 5'6". Looking at all these average numbers of what a enlisted person was. And then it was that actually brought me to Snafu. It was this idea of education and indoctrination. And I was like, oh, this is cool too. So I'm like, I'll make a podcast episode on it. And then I started writing for a podcast episode. I'm like, well, I can't really write this without watching all these things. So now I'm watching them, right? So now I'm invested, and I'm sitting there and I'm taking notes and I'm watching it. And I'm like, I can't, this isn't just a podcast episode. This isn't 10 minutes, and that's how it became an article. I write an article.
I can't believe it's not a book. I've been to Amazon going, there must be a book on Snafu. I can't believe that there isn't, because there is so many interesting connections. There is so many levels that he's operating on. The whole idea of using popular culture to sell an idea for war, motivate people for war, and actually as a training thing, all wrapped up in a 4-minute package. It's phenomenal. It's really sophisticated thinking.
And it's part of such a broader thing. I mean, the U.S. military did such a great job of selling this war to the soldiers, but also in Hollywood, everything else. The U.S. government did an amazing job selling this war to everybody else. And I wrote an article for Military History magazine here stateside about Yank magazine. And I remember when I pitched it to the editor, he was such a great guy. I'm like, hey, I want to write an article about the greatest military magazine, meanwhile, I'm writing it to a magazine called Military History. That was also a very enlightening article because Yank kind of goes hand in hand with comic books, and it goes hand in hand with Snafu because if you know much about Yank magazine, it was written by soldiers. It was not written by just journalists. It was written by soldiers that were journalists or journalists that were soldiers. It was for us, by us kind of thing, Every Yank magazine, even if you pull them out now, it always has the sweetheart back home in the back cover, right? You have this, whether it's an actress or it's some known woman, a pinup. It always had a pinup. It had a comic book section in it. The Sat Sack was often incorporated into it, which was a very similar aspect, of being in army sucks, but we're going to get through it. It was kind of like Snafu, but a comic book form of it. And it had a lot of letters where people could complain about, essentially they could complain about their bosses. They complain about the lieutenants and the sergeants and all that stuff. And it was this idea, we're in this together. We're going to get through it together. And between Yank and all of this, it was all designed to instill a feeling of camaraderie. We need to do what we need to do in order to finish this for all of us to go home, I mean, they sold it. They sold the war.
They did, and we should perhaps circle back and look at the Yank for another episode. Thanks, Peter. That was awesome. For those of you who want to dive deeper into Private Snafu, Peter's article is published by World War II History magazine. I'll put a link in the show notes. Don't forget, Peter is also the author of The Death of General Sikorski, whose mysterious death in Gibraltar was the focus of a previous episode, so be sure to check that out. And you can also find Peter hosting his podcast, History Shorts, available on all major podcast platforms. Now, if you've enjoyed the show and would like to support it, why not consider becoming a patron? A small monthly contribution helps me dedicate the time needed to bring these episodes together. Patrons get access to an advert-free version of the show, plus bonus content, including off-topic conversations that didn't make it into the main episode. You can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. Your support does make a huge difference. Well, that is all from me for this year. Thank you so much for your continued support, and I wish you all a very happy new year for 2025.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.